A military fighter pilot was on that plane, sitting quietly in row 17 like any other passenger. Her code name was Valkyrie 9. She felt the danger before the pilots did. She offered to help. The captain refused. Then the plane went into emergency, and 198 lives depended on the woman he had turned away. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. It was Saturday afternoon. August 19, 2023. The kind of afternoon that Boston does well in summer, warm, a little hazy, the kind of light that made everything look slightly golden. Boston Logan International Airport was busy the way it always got busy in August. Tourists were leaving. Locals were returning. Families moved through the terminal in slow, tired clusters. Business travelers walked fast with rolling bags and no expression. A few college students carried backpacks too big for their frames, heading back to California schools before the semester started. The city was exhaling after a long week. Everyone was going somewhere they were glad to be going. United Airlines Flight 3847 was boarding at Gate B14. Boston to San Francisco. Boeing 737-900ER. Departure at 1:15 p.m. 198 passengers. 6 crew. 5 hours and 40 minutes of scheduled flight time. Outside the gate windows, the aircraft sat on the tarmac in the full August sun, its white fuselage reflecting the light back in long horizontal bands. Ground crew moved around it with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this hundreds of times and would do it hundreds more. Fuel. Luggage. Catering. The quiet machinery of a departure. Nobody was paying attention to the woman in row 17. She was sitting in the window seat, left side, the way she always sat. She had a book open in her lap. Her carry-on was in the overhead bin, placed neatly without taking up more space than it needed. She was dressed simply. Dark pants, a light gray shirt, a jacket she had folded over the empty seat beside her. She looked like what the manifest said she was, a professional in her late 30s, traveling for work. Unhurried. Composed. The manifest said, Cara Donovan. Aerospace consultant. Boston, Massachusetts. That was accurate. It was just not complete. To understand what happened on Flight 3847 that Saturday afternoon, you have to go back 7 years. You have to go to a room. A small, official room at Langley Air Force Base, Virginia. June 3, 2016. The kind of room where important decisions had been made for a long time, and you could feel it in the furniture and the walls and the particular quality of the silence inside it. The silence of a place that had absorbed many difficult truths and kept all of them. It was a military tribunal. Formal but not public. The kind that handled things within the institution, quietly, the way the institution preferred to handle things. There were no cameras. There were no journalists. There was just a long table, 3 senior officers, and the 2 people whose accounts of the same event could not both be true. 3 senior officers sat at the table. They had the faces of people who had made difficult decisions before and were preparing to make another one. They held their pens and looked at their documents and waited with the patience of people who had waited in rooms like this many times before. On one side of the room sat Captain Cara Donovan. 29 years old. F-22 Raptor pilot. First Fighter Wing, Langley. One of the most exceptional pilots the wing had seen in a decade. Her record said so clearly. Her evaluation said so clearly. Every pilot who had flown beside her said so clearly. Her call sign was Valkyrie 9. She had earned it in her second year of F-22 qualification, in a training exercise over the Atlantic, when she had done something with an inherently unstable supersonic aircraft that the instructor said should not have been possible and then argued about for 3 days afterward. She was there because of another incident over the Atlantic. A training exercise 6 weeks earlier. She had executed a maneuver her commanding officer called unauthorized and reckless. She called it necessary. The weather data supported her. The flight data could be read either way. The commanding officer's account was clear and precise and completely left out the things she had been responding to. What was not mixed was the testimony of the pilot who had been in the adjacent aircraft. He had been there. He had seen exactly what happened. He had seen the cloud formation and the radar anomaly and the position she had been in and what she had done about it and why. He knew whether the maneuver had been reckless or necessary because he had been 12 feet away when she made it. That pilot was Captain David Marsh. 31 years old. F-22 pilot. Same wing. He had flown alongside her for 18 months. He knew her flying. He knew what he had seen on the day in question. He knew the truth of it as clearly as he had ever known anything in the air. He knew. The tribunal asked him directly. Captain Marsh. Did Captain Donovan's maneuver endanger your aircraft or the exercise? He looked at the table. Not at her. At the table. I cannot corroborate her account of the circumstances, he said. It was not technically a lie. He had not said she was wrong. He had simply refused to say she was right. But in that room, on that day, with those 3 senior officers looking at him and already leaning a certain way, it amounted to the same thing. He could have said what he saw. He had every opportunity. He had been asked directly and he had found a way to answer without answering, and everyone in the room understood what that meant. Kara sat very still through all of it. She did not look at the table. She looked at him. She watched his face while he looked at the table and said what he said and did not say what he knew. She watched the particular quality of stillness a person had when they were choosing one thing over another and had already made the choice and were simply executing it. She never knew for certain why he had done it. She had theories. She had spent years testing those theories in the quiet hours, in the particular darkness of 3 a.m. when the mind went to places it had no business going. She had built cases and dismantled them and built them again. She had never been able to prove any of them. The truth of his reasons had stayed with him and she had only ever had the evidence of the table he had looked at and the thing he had chosen not to say. 3 weeks after the tribunal, she was medically discharged. Not court-martialed. Not convicted of anything specific. Just discharged. A medical reason was cited. A technicality that everyone in the room understood was not about medicine. It was about the tribunal, and the testimony that had not come, and the institutional necessity of resolving the question cleanly and without public complication. Valkyrie 9. Grounded. That was 7 years ago. After the discharge, Kara did not fall apart. She wanted to, for a while. She allowed herself that. A year of anger, real, sustained, the kind of anger that had somewhere specific to go because it was not general anger at the universe but specific anger at a specific person and a specific decision. That kind of anger was almost useful. It kept her moving when the alternative was to stop. A year of being lost. Which was different from the anger and harder in some ways. The anger at least had an object. The lost year was just absence. The absence of the thing that had defined her since she was 19 years old and had looked up at an F-22 doing a low pass at an air show and known, with the complete certainty that visited you only a few times in a life, that she was going to fly that aircraft. She had flown it. For 4 years. And then she had not. A year of figuring out what you did when the thing that had defined you was taken. What you built. What you were when you were not that. Then she rebuilt. Not quickly. Not easily. She went back to school. Aviation systems. Flight safety analysis. She got certifications. She built a consulting practice from nothing, one client at a time, one safety review at a time, each engagement slightly larger than the last. She was good at it. Better than good. She had spent 4 years flying the F-22, an aircraft so advanced and so aerodynamically unstable that it required constant computer correction to maintain flight. An aircraft that made you understand instability the way a surgeon understood tissue, not theoretically, but in your hands and your body and the place where your decisions came from. She understood aircraft failure at a level most commercial consultants never reached. Her clients were in Boston, Seattle, and London. She flew commercial often. Always window seat, left side. She still read aircraft through the glass the way she had always read them. Old habit. Good habit. The kind of habit that stayed with you because it had been useful and might be useful again. She had made rules for herself about the tribunal. You were allowed to think about it once a day, maximum. Not more than once. You could not let it live in the present tense alongside everything else. It had happened. It was done. She was here now. This was what here looked like, a good practice, good clients, work that used what she knew. On the morning of August 19, 2023, she had used her once for the day at the gate. She had been sitting at gate B14, book open, not yet reading, watching the gate area with the general distracted attention of someone who was thinking about something else. And she had looked up and seen the crew walking through the gate toward the aircraft. She had looked at the captain's face. The gray at the temples was new. The uniform was different. The airline was different. 7 years had made themselves known in the small specific ways that 7 years always did. The face was the same. The face of the man who had looked at the table. She had looked back at her book. She had not moved her seat. She was not going to rearrange her day around David Marsh. She had spent 3 years doing exactly that, rearranging her thinking, her choices, her entire professional life around the shape of what he had done and what had followed from it. She was done with that. She had been done with it for years. She boarded when her row was called. She found row 17. She sat down. She looked out at Boston Harbor, August light, a ferry crossing the water, the city doing its Saturday thing in the distance. She watched it until boarding was complete and the doors were closed. Then she opened her book. Captain David Marsh was 38 years old. United Airlines. 3 years on the 737-900ER, which he had come to know as well as he had known the F-22, differently but as completely. Before the 737, 2 years on the 757. Before that, commercial flight school and the long methodical transition out of the Air Force, which he had left voluntarily in 2018, 2 years after the tribunal. He had not been pushed out. He had left. That distinction mattered to him in ways he had never fully examined. He had not thought about the tribunal often. He had told himself that. He had also, if he was honest, thought about it more than he wanted to admit. There were specific times, late approaches in bad weather, moments when a decision had to be made quickly and with incomplete information, when the room in Virginia surfaced without warning. Not the decision he had made there. Just the room. The table. The specific quality of the silence after he had spoken. He had told himself, when it surfaced, that he had done what he needed to do. That the situation had been complicated. That he had not technically lied. He had constructed these defenses carefully and maintained them carefully, and they were good enough for most days. They were wallpaper. Present but unnoticed. Background of the room. He did his pre-flight checks with the thoroughness he brought to everything. He walked through the aircraft with his first officer, Kelly Torres, 31 years old, 4,800 hours, the kind of first officer who made a captain's job easier by doing her own job excellently without requiring management. They checked every system. They ran every procedure. Outside on the tarmac the ground crew was finishing the final loading. Inside, the cabin crew was preparing for boarding. Everything in its place, everything according to procedure, the ordinary machinery of a commercial departure running exactly as it should. He did not walk through the passenger cabin. He never did on routine departures. He had no way of knowing who was in row 17. The first 2 hours of Flight 3847 were smooth. Textbook smooth. Takeoff roll clean, rotate at the correct speed, gear up, flaps up, the aircraft climbing through the Boston airspace with the easy competence of a well-maintained machine in the hands of an experienced crew. Boston fell away to the east. The Atlantic appeared briefly, dark blue and utterly flat at this altitude, then disappeared as they turned west. New England passed beneath them, green, dense, bisected by highways that looked thin as threads from 37,000 feet. Kara read. Not the Airbus systems guide she sometimes carried for work, today was supposed to be a day without technical reading. A real book. A novel. She had been carrying it for 2 months and had read 40 pages and kept meaning to get back to it. She read 40 more pages. She looked out the window. Ohio below, flat and green, rivers catching the afternoon light in silver curves. She thought briefly about the consulting engagement, the safety review starting Monday, the people she would be sitting across from, the report she had spent 6 weeks preparing. She thought, for one moment, about the man in the cockpit. She applied the rule. She had already used her once. She went back to her novel. She ordered coffee when the cart came. Drank it. Read another 30 pages. Then she felt something. It was not dramatic. It was not sudden. It was emotion. The aircraft was oscillating in the pitch axis, nose up, nose down, nose up, nose down. Very slightly. Almost imperceptible to anyone who had not spent years reading aircraft the way other people read faces. A gentle rocking. Regular. Rhythmic. One cycle every 4 seconds. The kind of thing that could be wind, could be turbulence, could be nothing at all if you were not paying a very specific kind of attention. Kara was paying that kind of attention. She looked out the window. Checked the horizon line. Yes. There it was, a slight oscillation, slow and even, the nose rising and falling in a rhythm that was not random. She looked at the wing. The flight control surfaces, the ailerons, the spoilers, were moving more than they should be moving in smooth air at cruise altitude. They were fighting something. The autopilot was fighting it, or the pilots were, or both. She watched for 30 seconds. The oscillation was not getting worse. But it was not getting better. It was holding at a steady amplitude, which meant something was sustaining it rather than damping it. A passive oscillation in smooth air would damp itself out naturally. This one was not damping. She looked around the cabin. The man in 17B had a spreadsheet open and had not looked up from it. The couple in 17D and 17E were watching a movie together, sharing earbuds, completely unaware. The woman 2 rows ahead was asleep. Nobody around her had registered anything unusual. The cabin had the settled, slightly drowsy quality of a long flight in its middle hours. She noticed. They did not. She had spent 4 years flying the F-22 Raptor. The F-22 was inherently aerodynamically unstable by design. It could not maintain straight and level flight without the constant active intervention of its flight control computer, which made microcorrections thousands of times per second. Human pilots in the F-22 felt every shift, every oscillation, every deviation as a matter of course. You did not learn to ignore instability. You learned to read it. You developed a sensitivity that lived in your nervous system long after you stopped flying the aircraft. You felt things that other pilots did not feel because your baseline for normal had been calibrated by something other people had not experienced. This oscillation was registering. She thought about what could cause rhythmic pitch oscillation on a commercial 737 in smooth air at cruise altitude. The list was not long. Turbulence, no, the air was smooth and the oscillation was too regular. Autopilot hunting, possible, but this felt too sustained. Trim system irregularity, most likely. A possible runaway trim situation in early stages, with the autopilot compensating, which was creating a feedback loop, the trim running in one direction, the autopilot correcting in the other, the trim system reading the autopilot's correction as a new command and running further, the autopilot correcting further. If that was what this was, it would get worse. Not quickly, but steadily and inevitably. She looked at the cockpit door. She thought about who was on the other side. She sat with that for a full moment. The weight of it was real. She was not going to pretend it was not real. Then she stood up. James was the forward flight attendant, 33 years old, 8 years with United, the easy professional calm of someone who had managed every kind of unusual situation without making it larger than it was. He was in the galley, checking supplies, when Kara approached. "Can I help you?" "I need you to take a message to the captain," she said. Her voice was quiet. Direct. The specific quietness of someone who was not alarmed and needed the person they were talking to also not be alarmed. "Tell him, Valkyrie 9 is ready to help." James looked at her. "I'm sorry." "Those words exactly. Valkyrie 9 is ready to help. He'll understand what it means." James had 8 years of professional training in managing unusual passenger requests. This was unusual. "Ma'am, is there a concern I can?" "The aircraft has a pitch oscillation that has been developing for approximately 3 minutes, she said, still quiet, still direct, her voice not carrying past the galley. "I am a former F-22 pilot and a current aerospace safety consultant. I believe I understand what is causing it. The captain needs to know I'm here and that I'm offering to help. Please give him that message." James looked at her face. It was calm. Clear. Not frightened. Not dramatic. The face of someone who was doing something routine that happened to be urgent. "I'll pass it along," he said. He went to the cockpit door. Knocked the sequence. Entered. James delivered the message. "Valkyrie 9 is ready to help." David's hands on the controls stopped moving for exactly 1 full second. Kelly Torres, sitting to his right, was in the middle of a system check. She noticed the stillness. She looked at him. "Captain." He recovered. Smooth. Professional. The seamless recovery of someone with 21,000 hours. You did not show the thing that had just hit you, not on the flight deck, not with a first officer watching, not when there was work to do. He knew that call sign. He had known it the moment the first syllable reached him. He had not heard it spoken aloud in 7 years, and it had arrived in this cockpit on a Saturday afternoon over the American Midwest and hit him in the chest with the specific force of something that had been waiting to arrive for a long time. He knew exactly what it meant. He knew exactly who was sitting in the passenger cabin of his aircraft. He looked at his instruments. The trim indication was slightly irregular but within parameters. The autopilot was managing. The oscillation Kara had felt in row 17 was visible on his instruments if you looked for it, but manageable. He was handling it. He made a decision. "Tell her we don't need assistance," he said. "Thank her." James returned. He delivered the captain's response. Kara looked at him steadily. She nodded once. Not in surprise. "Tell him I'll be in my seat," she said. She went back to row 17. Sat down. Looked out the window. Watched the wing. Watched the oscillation. It was getting worse. What neither David nor Kelly could fully see from the cockpit instruments in real time was what Kara had been watching from the outside, the developing failure of the trim system's interaction with the autopilot's compensation. The system had been building this failure quietly for nearly 2 hours. The autopilot had been making small corrections, constant and precise, keeping the aircraft stable. From inside the cockpit it had looked like normal autopilot management. Nothing alarming. Nothing outside parameters. Then came the secondary failure. A trim actuator fault. Not a sudden failure, a degradation. The stabilizer trim began moving uncommanded. Not dramatically, not all at once. But consistently. Nose down. Nose down. Nose down. A slow, steady pressure pulling the aircraft's nose toward the earth. The autopilot responded correctly. It pulled back. Applied correction. Tried to maintain altitude and attitude. Which caused the trim to run further in the nose-down direction, because the autopilot's correction created a new input that the faulty trim system read as a command and amplified. The autopilot corrected again. The trim ran again. Each correction created a larger deviation. Each larger deviation required a stronger correction. The feedback loop that had been building for 2 hours beneath the surface became explicit and visible in a matter of seconds. The aircraft began pitching. Not gently now. Definitely. Measurably. The nose rising too high and then falling too far and then rising again, each cycle slightly larger than the one before. Kelly looked at the autopilot display. Trim runaway. Her voice was controlled. Exactly as trained. David disconnected the autopilot. Took manual control. Standard response. The correct response according to every procedure he had trained to, every checklist he had practiced, every simulator session he had completed. In manual control, the aircraft's behavior immediately got worse. His inputs were fighting the trim. The trim was fighting his inputs. Every correction he applied created a new oscillation because it fed energy back into the system. Every new oscillation required a new correction. Every correction made it worse. The aircraft was rocking in pitch with increasing amplitude, the motion now felt clearly in the cabin, the nose coming up and going down and coming up again with a rhythm that had nothing to do with turbulence. In the cabin, heads came up. Hands reached for armrests. A child in economy started to cry. The flight attendants moved toward their jump seats without announcement, and that movement, quiet, purposeful, uncommunicative, was enough to make passengers look at each other with the specific expression of people who have just noticed that something is not normal. Kelly was running the trim runaway checklist. Page by page. Precisely. Correctly. She was doing exactly what the training said to do. It was not resolving. Because this was not a standard trim runaway. The checklist had been designed for the typical failure mode, an actuator running in one direction that needed to be stopped. It had not been designed for a feedback loop between a faulty trim actuator and the flight control system's response to manual inputs. The two systems were talking to each other in a way that normal procedure had not anticipated. David's every correction was correct procedure and was making it worse. He looked at Kelly. She was on her third pass through the checklist. Her face was professional. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were telling a different story from her face. He looked at the oscillation on his attitude indicator. Increasing. He thought about the call sign. About the room in Virginia. About the table he had looked at. About 7 years of wallpaper. He picked up the interphone. James. Bring her up. James found Kara in row 17. She was watching the wing. She had not opened her book again. She had her hands in her lap and her eyes on the wing and the expression of someone doing a job they were qualified to do and were not yet able to do anything about. The captain is asking for you, James said. She looked at him. Then at the wing one more time. The oscillation was unmistakable now, visible through the window, the wing flexing with the rhythm of the pitching aircraft. Around her, passengers were gripping armrests. The couple in 17D and 17E had taken their earbuds out. The man with the spreadsheet had finally looked up. She stood. She did not hurry. Hurrying was not useful and it would alarm the passengers around her. She moved through the cabin at a steady, unhurried pace. The people she passed watched her with the searching attention of frightened people looking for something that looked unfrightened. She walked past them and they watched her go and some of them felt, without knowing why, slightly better. She reached the cockpit door. James opened it. She stepped through. The cockpit was full of information. Lights. Tones. 2 experienced pilots working hard. Kelly was at the checklist, her voice steady as she read the steps and executed them. David had both hands on the yoke, large corrections, working against the oscillation with everything he had been trained to apply. He looked back at her. One moment. Full eye contact. 7 years compressed into that moment like air into a small space. Then it was gone. There was no time for 7 years. There was this cockpit. This aircraft. 198 people behind that door. She looked at the instrument panel. She read it fast and completely. Trim indication. Attitude indicator. Airspeed. His inputs on the controls, large, frequent, fighting. The amplitude of the oscillation and the timing of his corrections and the relationship between them. She understood immediately. "What's your status?" she said. Not hello. Not 7 years. Just the situation. David told her. Short, clear. Trim runaway procedure not resolving. Manual inputs making it worse. He said it the way pilots communicated, facts without decoration, time being the only resource that mattered. She listened. Watched the attitude indicator. Watched the trim indication. Watched his hands. "You're fighting it," she said. "I'm correcting." "You're fighting it." Every correction you make feeds the oscillation. The trim system is reading your inputs as commands and responding with more movement in the wrong direction. You are adding energy to the system every time you correct. You need to stop. Kelly looked at her. Stop controlling the aircraft. Reduce airspeed first. Significantly. Below 200 knots. Then hands off the controls for 30 seconds. Hands off. 30 seconds. Let the oscillation damp naturally. At lower airspeed, the aerodynamic damping characteristics of this aircraft are sufficient to reduce the oscillation amplitude without active input from you. But it will only work if you stop adding energy to the system with your corrections. After 30 seconds you isolate the trim actuator manually. Not through the autopilot. The panel to the left of the throttles. Cover off, switch down. Then the oscillation will continue to decrease and you will have a stable aircraft with fixed trim, which you can compensate for manually on the approach. David looked at the oscillation on his attitude indicator. Getting worse with every correction he applied. He could see the relationship, he could feel it in the controls, the way each input created the next oscillation larger than the one it had corrected. He could see it and he could not stop doing it because stopping was the opposite of everything 21,000 hours of training had put into him. If I take my hands off an oscillating aircraft with this amplitude, the aircraft will continue to oscillate for 30 seconds. The amplitude will not increase at reduced airspeed. It will decrease. The aerodynamics are working in your favor below 200 knots. The instability you are fighting is not aerodynamic. It is your own corrections feeding the trim fault. Stop the corrections. Let the aerodynamics do what they are designed to do. How do you know this? She held his gaze. No hesitation. Because I flew an aircraft that was inherently unstable for 4 years. An aircraft that the computer had to correct thousands of times per second to maintain flight. I spent 4 years learning that there was a difference between working with instability and fighting it. When you fight it you add energy. When you work with it you let the system's own characteristics resolve it. That is what I am telling you to do. Reduce speed. Take your hands off. Trust the aerodynamics for 30 seconds. Then isolate manually. You're asking me to remove my hands from the controls of a pitching aircraft with nearly 200 people on board. For 30 seconds. Yes. And if you're wrong? A pause. Brief. Complete. I'm not wrong. He looked at the instruments. The oscillation amplitude still increasing. His correction still feeding it. He looked at Kelly. She was looking at Kara, then at the instruments, then at him. Her voice was quiet when she spoke. The checklist isn't resolving it, Kelly said. David looked at his hands on the controls. Then he looked at the woman standing behind the center console. The woman whose career had ended in a small official room in Virginia because he had looked at a table instead of at the truth. Who had offered to help from row 17 and whom he had turned away because of who she was and what she meant and what it would cost him to let her in. She was right. He knew she was right. He could feel it in the controls. He reduced airspeed. Throttles back. The aircraft slowing. 220 knots. 210. 200. He took his hands off the controls. The aircraft oscillated. The cabin felt it fully now. The sudden loss of active correction made the motion more apparent, gasps from multiple rows, the sound of something shifting in an overhead bin, a woman's voice saying something short and frightened, the child in economy crying louder. The particular sounds of 200 people understanding simultaneously that something was wrong. Kelly's hands were on the panel, not the controls. Ready to act on a word. Her eyes moved between the attitude indicator and the airspeed and the trim indication and the clock. She was counting seconds. Kara was watching the attitude indicator. Still. Focused. The expression of someone who had done this before in a different aircraft in different circumstances and was doing it again now. David's hands were in his lap. That sentence does not carry its own weight. David Marsh had 21,000 hours of flight time. He had been trained by the United States Air Force in one of the most demanding fast jet programs in the world. He had been trained by 2 commercial airlines in procedures that covered every anticipated failure mode. In every scenario, in every emergency, the answer had always been the same: act. Correct. Hold on. Do something. The fundamental pilot instinct, the thing that 21,000 hours had put so deep into his body that it was not a thought anymore but a reflex, was take control. Hold on. Do not let go. His hands were in his lap. 5 seconds. The oscillation continued. Amplitude unchanged. 10 seconds. The nose rising too high, the nose falling too far, the rhythm of a system in conflict with itself. Someone in the cabin was saying something repeatedly in what sounded like a prayer, the syllables coming through the cockpit door, regular and quiet, just sound. 15 seconds. 20 seconds. David's hands had not moved. 23 seconds. The oscillation amplitude, not increasing. 25 seconds. Slightly decreasing. Measurably. The nose not rising quite as high. Not falling quite as far. 28 seconds. Definitely decreasing. The rhythm still there but smaller. The motion becoming something the aircraft was recovering from rather than escalating into. 30 seconds. Now, Kara said. Trim actuator. Manual isolation. Panel left of the throttles. Cover off. Switch down. Kelly's hands moved immediately. Cover off, she confirmed. Switch down. The trim actuator isolated. Cut from the rest of the system. No longer able to receive commands. No longer feeding the loop. The fault still present in the hardware, but silenced, unable to propagate. The oscillation continued to decrease. The motion becoming smaller and smaller, the rhythm slowing, the aircraft finding its own level. 35 seconds after David had taken his hands off the controls, the aircraft was flying straight. Not perfectly, the trim was fixed in a slightly nose-down position, which meant back pressure on the controls would be needed for the remainder of the flight. The controls would be heavy. The workload would be elevated. These were manageable things. David put his hands back on the controls. Felt the aircraft. The back pressure needed. The resistance of the fixed trim. The solid, stable feeling of an aircraft flying correctly under human direction. He exhaled. One breath. The breath of someone who has held something for 30 seconds that cost more than air. Kelly closed the checklist. She looked at Kara. She said nothing. There was nothing in the checklist for what had just happened. Denver Center, United 3847. Trim runaway event resolved. Aircraft stable. Continuing to San Francisco with manual trim compensation. Declaring precautionary emergency for landing. Request priority handling SFO. Denver Center responded within 3 seconds. Priority granted. SFO notified. Emergency services standing by on landing. The professional, unhurried efficiency of a system that handled these moments without losing itself in them. Confirmed souls on board, Denver Center said. 204 souls, David said. He looked at Kara. She was looking at the trim isolation switch Kelly had thrown. Just looking at it. The small, specific, physical fact of a correct decision made. Stay for the approach, David said. She looked at him. You have it. You don't need me for the approach. I know, he said. Stay anyway. She stayed. San Francisco. Runway 28L. Evening light from the west, low, orange, the kind of light that made the bay look like hammered copper. The approach took 40 minutes. David flew it with the focused precision of someone who had done this thousands of times and was doing it this time as if it were the first. Kelly managed systems and communications. She was excellent. She had always been excellent. Kara stood behind the center console and said nothing unless she was asked. Twice she was asked, once about the back pressure compensation needed at their landing weight with the trim fixed in its current position, once about the flare technique with the trim as it was. Both times she answered in one sentence. No more than was needed. David flew the approach. He flew it the way he had flown 10,000 approaches. Careful. Methodical. By the numbers. But different. He knew it was different. The difference was not in the trim or the procedure or the fixed back pressure in his hands. It was something that had shifted in the space between 37,000 feet and the ground, during 30 seconds when his hands had been in his lap and he had trusted someone he had wronged. The aircraft touched down on runway 28L. Clean. Centered. Main gear down, nose down, thrust reversers, speed decelerating through the numbers in the right sequence. The aircraft slowing to taxi speed. The runway stretching ahead toward the taxiway, ordinary and wide and completely on the ground. 198 passengers. All safe. Emergency vehicles rolled alongside on the taxiway. Standard for a declared precautionary emergency. Some passengers would see them through the windows and understand. Most would not fully understand until later, until they were telling the story to someone and felt, only in the telling, how frightened they should have been. Passengers deplaned in the usual way. The post-landing shuffle, the overhead bins, the backpacks, the rolling bags, the slow file toward the forward door. Most of them had felt the oscillation. The questions were already starting, quiet exchanges in the aisles. The flight attendants answered carefully and professionally, the way they had been trained to answer, which was to say, everything is fine now, which was true. Kara took her carry-on from the overhead bin. Her book was in her bag. She had never finished the chapter. She walked through the jetway with everyone else, through the gate, into the terminal. San Francisco International on a Saturday evening, the particular exhausted relief texture of an airport at the end of a long travel day. She had a car booked. A hotel. The consulting engagement starting Monday morning, 32 pages of safety analysis she had spent 6 weeks preparing. She was thinking about the oscillation. About the trim actuator feedback loop. About the specific gap in current training that had made the correct solution so counterintuitive and so necessary. She was thinking about whether to add a formal case study to the safety review, a real-world data point the safety analysis community did not yet have. The counterintuitive solution. Why it worked. What it meant for how pilots were trained to respond to this specific failure mode. She was thinking about the work. She was good at the work. Ms. Donovan. She stopped. She turned. He had come off the aircraft in uniform and walked through the terminal to find her. That was not something captains did after precautionary emergency landings. There were reports to file. Debriefs. Airline procedures that began the moment the aircraft stopped moving and would continue for hours. He had come through the terminal anyway. She looked at him. He stood in front of her. The terminal moved around them, people with rolling bags, families finding each other, the Saturday evening noise of a large airport doing what large airports did. He looked like someone who had been trying to find words for a long time. I should have said something, he said. In that room. In Virginia. I knew what I saw. I knew your account was accurate. I could have said what I saw and I chose not to. She looked at him. Not with anger. She had spent a year in anger and it had not changed anything and she had gotten through it, and what was on the other side of it was not forgiveness exactly but something cleaner, clarity. The ability to look at a thing directly without needing it to be different. Why didn't you? She said. He looked at the floor. Then back at her. Then directly at her. I was afraid of what it would cost me. If I contradicted the commanding officer's account. If I said what I actually saw. I was afraid of what that would do to my career. He stopped. Let it be said fully. I chose my career over the truth. And it cost you yours. He said it without softening it. Without the careful management of how a confession sounded when you were trying to confess and also trying to look good while confessing. Just the truth. 7 years late. Still the truth. Kara stood with that for a moment. It was the answer she had suspected. The answer she had constructed and dismantled and constructed again in the quiet hours. The reason she had never been able to fully close the door on it. Not because she needed revenge. Not because she needed him punished. Because she needed to know if she had understood it correctly. Whether the shape of it was the shape she had lived with or something else. It was the shape she had lived with. She looked at him steadily. You said something today, she said. He looked at her. Not immediately understanding. When you took your hands off the controls, she said. That was the hardest thing you have done in a long time. I know that. Not technically. You understood technically what I was telling you to do. But you had to trust me to do it. You had to let go of the controls of your own aircraft and trust someone you had wronged. And you did it. She paused. That is what I needed you to do 7 years ago in that room. You did it today instead. He was quiet. She picked up her bag. It's not enough, she said. Not with heat. Not cruelly. Stating a fact the way she stated facts, clearly, without decoration. What happened in that room is not erased by what happened today. My career ended because you chose not to say what you knew. That is real and it happened and it cannot unhappen. She looked at him steadily. But you did something right today. I saw it. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. She turned to go. Donovan, he said. She stopped. Valkyrie 9, he said. Just those 2 words. Then, I'm sorry. She looked at him over her shoulder. 2 words. 7 years late. Necessary anyway. I know, she said. She walked away. Through the terminal. Through the families and the business travelers and the tourists, all of them moving in the particular direction of their own lives, unaware of what had happened above them at 37,000 feet and what was happening now at ground level between 2 people in the middle of a crowd. She did not feel lighter. What had happened in that room in Virginia was still real. It would always be real. Nothing said in a terminal changed it. She was not naive enough to pretend otherwise, and she had spent too long being exactly who she was to start now. But something had shifted. Something that had been held at a specific tension for a long time, not the anger, which had long since passed, but something underneath the anger, something structural, had moved. Not resolved. Not forgiven. Released. There was a difference between those things and she knew it, and the difference was real. She walked through the exit. Into the San Francisco evening. Toward her car. Toward the city. Toward Monday morning. Monday morning. San Francisco. A conference room in the United Airlines Safety Division offices, high enough up that you could see the bay from the windows if you looked at the right angle. 6 airline safety officers across the table from her. Experienced people. Serious people. The kind of people who did the work of keeping passengers safe in the air and understood exactly what that work cost and chose to do it anyway. She had sat across from people like this in Boston and Seattle and London. She respected them. She had a 32-page report. Built over 6 weeks. Detailed and specific and grounded in years of real-world analysis. On page 19, there was a section she had not had 6 weeks ago. She had written it Saturday night, alone in her hotel room, the city visible through the window, the light of the bay faint in the distance. It had taken 3 hours. She had written it carefully and precisely and without decoration, the way she wrote everything. The section was a case study. United Airlines Flight 3847. August 19, 2023. The trim actuator feedback loop. The specific failure mode that standard training had not anticipated. The counterintuitive correct response: reduce airspeed, hands off the controls, passive aerodynamic damping before active actuator isolation. Why current training prepared pilots for the standard failure and not for this one? What the difference was. What needed to change. The 6 safety officers read page 19. The room was quiet in the way rooms got quiet when something important was being absorbed. One officer read it twice. Another looked out the window at the bay and looked back at it and did not look away again until he had finished. The senior safety officer was 58 years old. 26 years in commercial aviation safety. He had seen a great deal. He looked up. "This happened on your flight to San Francisco," he said. "Yes," she said. "You were the passenger who assisted." "Yes." He looked at the report. At page 19. At the woman across the table who had written it and lived it on the same Saturday afternoon. "Why aren't you still flying?" he said. She looked at him. She thought about the room in Virginia. The table. The face. The discharge. The year of anger. The year of being lost. The year of rebuilding. She thought about the consulting practice she had built from nothing. The clients in Boston and Seattle and London. The window seat, left side. The book she had never finished. "That's a long story," she said. "The short version is, I should be." He held her gaze. He looked at the report again. At page 19. He was a man who had spent 26 years making judgments about risk and competence and the specific qualities that kept people safe in the air, and he was making one now and she could see him making it. "We have a safety consultant position opening in January," he said. "Full-time. Aviation systems. Based here in San Francisco." A pause. It would require someone with a very specific background. Military fast jet experience. Commercial systems knowledge. Accident and incident analysis. The kind of combined perspective that, another pause. Shorter. That produces page 19. The room was quiet. Kara looked at the table. At her report. At page 19. The case study she had written Saturday night about the aircraft she had helped save. About the procedure that had worked because she had spent 4 years learning to work with instability rather than against it. About the 30 seconds over the Rocky Mountains. About what happened when a pilot trusted something that felt like the wrong thing and turned out to be the right thing. About Valkyrie 9. Who had never stopped being good enough. Even when they told her she wasn't. Even when the room in Virginia had gone the way it went and the years had passed and the career had been built differently, in a different shape, from different materials. Still good enough. She had always been good enough. She had just been spending years proving it to people who had not been in that room. "Send me the details," she said. She walked out of that conference room into the Monday morning hallway and stood there for a moment. The bay was visible from the window at the end of the corridor. The light on the water was nothing like the light over Ohio on Saturday afternoon, but light over water was light over water, and she had always found it clarifying. She stood there and looked at it. She thought about the position. Full-time. San Francisco. Aviation systems. The kind of work she had been doing from the outside, client by client, engagement by engagement, rebuilt piece by piece. This would be different. This would be inside. This would be the work done from the center of the institution rather than from a distance. That was different from consulting. That was different from what she had been doing. She thought about whether she wanted different. She thought about page 19. About the fact that she had written it on a Saturday night in a hotel room because she had been on that aircraft and she had felt what others had not felt, and she had stood up and gone to do something about it. She had not done it because of the job offer. She had done it because it was the right thing to do and she knew how. The job offer had come after. That was the correct order of things. She thought about Valkyrie 9. The call sign she had earned in her second year on the F-22 and had carried for 4 years and had not stopped carrying even when they told her to go. You did not stop being who you were because someone told you to leave. You just carried it differently. She walked back to the conference room. To the work. To Monday morning and the 32 pages and the 5 people who were waiting for her to tell them what she knew about how aircraft failed and how people responded to failure and what needed to change. She sat down. She opened her report. She turned to page 1 and began. That was who she was. Someone who kept working. Someone who used what she knew. Someone who had rebuilt from nothing and would build further still, because the work was real and she was good at it, and the work of keeping people safe in the air was the kind of work that was always worth doing. Valkyrie 9. Still flying. Just differently.